The envelope in my mailbox had "violation notice" stamped across it in angry red letters, and I hadn't even lived in my house for 3 months yet. I stood there in my driveway on that frigid February morning in Rockford, Illinois, staring at the paper like it might spontaneously combust. According to the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, my snow removal business violated some obscure covenant about operating commercial vehicles from residential properties. The irony wasn't lost on me that half my paying customers lived in this very neighborhood. My name is Ryan Bartlett, and I'd moved to this subdivision thinking it would be a fresh start after my divorce. The house was modest, a 3-bedroom ranch with a 2-car garage, perfect for storing my equipment. I ran a legitimate snow removal business with proper licensing and insurance. I had 20 regular clients scattered across Rockford and the surrounding areas, and business was booming this winter. We'd already had 6 major snowfalls since December, and February was shaping up to be even worse. I crumpled the notice and headed inside to call the number listed. A woman answered on the second ring with a tone that could freeze antifreeze. "Meadowbrook Hills HOA, this is Patricia speaking." "Hi, I'm Ryan Bartlett from 412 Oakwood Drive. I received a violation notice about my business vehicle and I'd like to discuss it." "Mr. Bartlett, yes. Your commercial truck violates Section 8, Paragraph 3 of our covenants. You have 14 days to remove it from the premises or face daily fines of $200. I took a deep breath. "The truck is parked in my garage. You can't even see it from the street." "Irrelevant. The covenant clearly states no commercial vehicles may be stored on residential properties within Meadowbrook Hills. Half the people in this neighborhood have work trucks. I've seen plumbing vans, electrician trucks, contractor vehicles all over the place. Those have been granted exemptions by the board. Your case will be reviewed at the next meeting in 2 weeks. Until then, the violation stands." She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, phone still in my hand, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. The real estate agent had mentioned an HOA, but assured me it was very reasonable and barely noticeable. 3 months in, and I was already dealing with violation notices. The next morning brought another 10 inches of snow. I was up at 4 a.m., coffee in hand, preparing to start my route. My clients paid good money for reliable snow removal, and I prided myself on being thorough and prompt. The truck rumbled to life in the garage, and I was backing out when I noticed a figure standing at the end of my driveway. A woman in a purple parka stood there, arms crossed, blocking my path. I rolled down my window, letting in a blast of frigid air. "Can I help you?" "You most certainly can. I'm Margaret Caldwell, HOA president. You need to clear my driveway before you go gallivanting off to do other driveways." I blinked snow out of my eyes. "I'm sorry, do you have me on your service schedule? I don't recognize your name from my client list." "I shouldn't have to pay. You live in this neighborhood, and as HOA president, I expect you to take care of board members first. It's called professional courtesy." Professional courtesy would be you not sending me violation notices for running a legitimate business. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have paying customers waiting. Her face turned the color of a tomato despite the cold. "You will regret this attitude, Mr. Bartlett. The board has ways of dealing with difficult residents." I closed my window and carefully backed around her. Through my rearview mirror, I watched her stomp back toward a large colonial house 3 doors down. So that was Margaret Caldwell, the HOA president. This was going to be an interesting winter. My first stop was old Mrs. Henderson on Maple Street, a sweet 78-year-old widow who always had hot cocoa waiting. Then, the Ramirez family on Pine, followed by the Johnsons, the Parkers, and about 15 other properties. The work was hard but satisfying, and by noon I'd cleared all 20 driveways on my route. My arms ached, my face felt frozen despite my balaclava, but my bank account was healthier for it. When I returned home, there was another envelope taped to my front door. This one cited me for creating excessive noise before 7 a.m. and tracking snow onto common areas. The common areas reference was absurd since I'd only driven on public streets. The noise complaint was equally ridiculous given that half the neighborhood had snowblowers running at dawn. I called Patricia again. This time she sounded almost gleeful. "Mr. Bartlett, the board takes violations very seriously. You now have 2 violations on record. 3 violations result in legal action. These are bogus charges and you know it. I'm being targeted. The board's decisions are final. If you wish to appeal, you may attend the next board meeting on February 20th at 7 p.m. Good day." Over the next week, the harassment escalated. I received violation notices for having my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours, for having window treatments that weren't approved neutral colors, and for parking my personal sedan at what they claimed was an unapproved angle in my driveway. Each notice came with the same red stamped header and the same threatening language about fines and legal action. I started documenting everything. I took photos of my property, of my truck stored in the garage, of my trash cans, my windows, everything. I photographed other houses in the neighborhood that had similar or worse violations, but weren't being cited. 3 houses had boats in their driveways. 1 guy had a rusted Camaro on blocks in his side yard. Another had a satellite dish the size of a small planet. None of them had violation notices fluttering from their doors. The snow kept falling. Rockford was having one of its worst winters on record, and my business was thriving. I'd even picked up 5 new clients from surrounding neighborhoods. The money was good enough that I'd started thinking about buying a second truck and hiring help for next season. Margaret Caldwell, however, was becoming a persistent problem. She'd started calling me at 6 a.m. every time it snowed, demanding I clear her driveway immediately. I let the calls go to voicemail. She'd leave increasingly hostile messages about neighborhood obligations and showing respect to authority. The morning of February 15th brought another massive storm. Weather reports predicted 18 to 24 inches, the kind of snow that could shut down the whole city. I was prepared, though, with a full tank of gas, a thermos of coffee the size of a fire extinguisher, and a playlist of classic rock to keep me energized. At 5:30 a.m., my phone rang. Margaret Caldwell. I ignored it. It rang again, and again. Finally, I answered. "It's 5:30 in the morning, Margaret. I need my driveway cleared immediately. I have a very important board meeting this evening and I cannot be stuck at home. I have 20 paying customers who take priority. If you'd like to sign up for my service, the seasonal rate is $400, or I can do one-time removals for $75 per occurrence. That's highway robbery. You should be ashamed, taking advantage of your neighbors like this." "I'm taking advantage. You've been harassing me with bogus violations since I moved in. You want my service, you pay for it like everyone else. We'll see about that. Don't be surprised when you find yourself facing serious consequences." She hung up, and I headed out to start my route. The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see 50 feet ahead. The truck's plow made quick work of most driveways, but this was heavy, wet snow that required extra effort. By 10 a.m., I was only halfway through my list, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor David, a guy about my age who worked from home. "Dude, there's a tow truck at your house. Just thought you should know. I called him immediately. "What's going on?" "Some woman is directing a tow truck driver to your garage, says she has authority to remove vehicles in violation of neighborhood covenants. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't let them take anything." I broke every speed limit getting home. When I pulled onto my street, I found Margaret Caldwell standing in my open garage, gesturing at my backup vehicle, a smaller pickup I used for residential jobs. A tow truck sat in my driveway, yellow lights flashing. I jumped out of my truck, snow flying. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Margaret turned, a triumphant smile on her face. "Removing vehicles in violation of community standards. The board has authorized this action. The board doesn't have the authority to enter my private property and seize my possessions. That's called theft." The tow truck driver, a burly guy with a beard, looked uncomfortable. "Madam, he's got a point. I need to see legal documentation before I can tow a vehicle from private property. I have the HOA covenant right here." Margaret waved a stapled document. "That's not a legal document authorizing vehicle seizure," I said. "You need a court order for that. What you're doing right now is criminal trespassing and attempted theft." The driver unhooked the chain he'd started attaching to my truck. "Sorry, lady, but I'm not touching this. I'm not getting involved in whatever dispute you people have going on." He climbed back in his truck and drove off, leaving Margaret standing in my garage sputtering with rage. "You can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm the HOA president. I have authority over this neighborhood." "You have authority over common areas and architectural approvals, assuming your HOA is even legally constituted. You don't have authority to enter my property without permission or seize my belongings. Now get out of my garage before I call the police." "The police? I'll call them myself." "You're in violation of multiple covenants. Go ahead." I pulled out my phone. "I'd love to have an officer here to document your attempted theft and trespassing." She stared at me for a long moment, then turned and marched back toward her house, her boots crunching in the snow. David appeared from his yard next door, grinning. "That was better than reality TV. Thanks for the heads up. I can't believe she tried to have my truck towed. She's been getting worse lately. Last month she tried to fine the Hendersons for having their Christmas lights up past January 5th. Before that, she went after the Patels for painting their shutters the wrong shade of gray. How is she still HOA president? Nobody else wants the job. Most people just pay the fines to avoid dealing with her. You're the first person who's really pushed back." That evening, I sat down and did something I should have done months ago. I requested a copy of the HOA's governing documents, the original Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, or CC and Rs, and all meeting minutes for the past 2 years. Under Illinois law, homeowners had a right to review these documents, and HOAs were required to provide them within 10 business days. I also started researching HOA law in Illinois. What I found was interesting. For an HOA to be legally binding, it had to be properly incorporated, registered with the state, and follow specific procedures for meetings, voting, and enforcement. Violations had to go through a proper hearing process before fines could be assessed. I had a suspicion that Meadowbrook Hills HOA wasn't following the rules. The next morning, Margaret's driveway remained buried under 2 feet of snow. So did her sidewalk. Several other driveways in the neighborhood were similarly untouched, but mine was clear, as were those of all my paying customers. I'd been out since 5 a.m. making sure everyone on my list could get to work. Margaret called at 8 a.m. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 8:15, 9, 9:30, and 10. The voicemails grew increasingly frantic. She was stuck. She had places to be. This was unacceptable. I was violating neighborhood standards by not helping residents in need. It was almost comical. Around 11, she appeared at my front door, pounding hard enough to rattle the frame. I opened it to find her looking disheveled, her hair uncombed, still wearing pajamas under her parka. My driveway. Now, I'll pay your ridiculous fee. $75 for a removal this size. Cash or check up front. Her jaw clenched. Fine. She pulled out her checkbook, scribbled angrily, and thrust it at me. I looked at the check. It was written for $50. This is $50. The price is $75. $50 is more than fair for 30 minutes of work. The price is $75, Margaret. That's what everyone else pays. I'm the HOA president. I should get a discount. Being HOA president doesn't entitle you to discounts on private services. You want your driveway cleared, the price is $75. Take it or leave it. She stared at me with pure hatred, then snatched the check back and wrote a new one for $75. I looked it over carefully, checking the date, the amount in numbers and words, her signature. Everything was correct. I'll get to it this afternoon after I finish my scheduled appointments. This afternoon? No, now. I need to get out now. My paying customers who scheduled service in advance take priority. I'll get to yours by 4 p.m. at the latest. This is unacceptable. I demand you do my driveway right now. Then you're demanding a rush service, which costs an additional $50. Her face went through several shades of red and purple. For a moment, I thought she might actually explode. Then she turned and stomped back through the snow toward her house, her pajama pants getting soaked. I went back inside, made myself lunch, and headed out to complete my afternoon appointments. True to my word, I arrived at Margaret's house at 3:45 p.m. Her driveway was a mess, with compacted snow from her attempts to drive through it and icy patches where the sun had melted and refrozen the surface. It took me an hour to do a proper job, but when I finished, her driveway was cleaner than it had been all winter. I even cleared her sidewalk as a courtesy, though I hadn't charged for that. Professional pride meant doing good work, even for people I didn't like. Margaret came out as I was finishing up. She inspected the work with a critical eye, clearly looking for something to complain about. Finally, she said, the edges aren't even. The edges follow your driveway, which isn't even. If you want perfectly straight edges on a curved driveway, you'll need to hire a magician, not a snow removal service. Your attitude is appalling. I'm going to report this shoddy work to the Better Business Bureau. Feel free. I'm a plus rated with 0 complaints. Make sure to mention that I completed the work as agreed, for the price quoted within the time frame specified. I climbed back in my truck. Have a great evening, Margaret. The HOA meeting on February 20th fell during a brief warm spell. Temperatures had climbed into the 40s, and the mountains of snow were starting to shrink. I arrived at the community center at 6:50 p.m., armed with my laptop, a folder full of printed documents, and a voice recorder app on my phone. The community center was a converted garage bay in the neighborhood's maintenance building. Folding chairs faced a plastic table where Margaret sat with 2 other board members, a nervous-looking man in his 50s named Gerald, and a woman about Margaret's age named Susan. About 15 other residents were scattered in the audience. Margaret called the meeting to order at 7 p.m. sharp. She went through standard business, approving previous meeting minutes, discussing the budget for landscape maintenance, debating whether to repair or replace a broken light at the entrance. Then she got to new business. We have several enforcement matters to discuss. First, 412 Oakwood Drive, owned by Ryan Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett has accumulated 7 violations in 3 months, including operating a commercial business from residential property, excessive noise, improper parking, unapproved window treatments, trash can violations, and failure to maintain neighborhood standards. I'd like to address those accusations, I said, standing up. Margaret frowned. Residents may speak during the public comment period at the end of the meeting. These accusations directly concern me, and I have a right to respond. Illinois HOA law requires that residents be given an opportunity to respond to violations before fines are assessed. Have you been assessing fines? She looked uncomfortable. The violations are documented. Fines are standard procedure. That's not an answer. Have fines been assessed against my property? Gerald, the nervous man, spoke up. According to our records, fines totaling $1,400 have been assessed, without a hearing, without giving me a chance to respond. That's a violation of state law. I opened my laptop. I've done some research into the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. I requested your governing documents 2 weeks ago and received nothing, so I did my own digging. According to county records, this HOA was incorporated in 1987 but dissolved in 2003 for failure to file annual reports. It was never reinstated. The room went quiet. Margaret's face lost color. That's not true. We've been operating continuously. Operating and legally existing are two different things. A dissolved corporation has no legal authority to assess fines, enforce covenants, or collect dues. Every fine you've assessed, every rule you've enforced, every dollar you've collected for the past 22 years has been done without legal authority. Susan, the other board member, looked panicked. Gerald, is this true? Gerald was frantically typing on his phone. I don't know. Margaret handles all the corporate paperwork. What paperwork? Margaret snapped. The HOA runs itself. We don't need to file reports with the state. Yes, you do, I said. Illinois law requires all homeowner associations to register as not-for-profit corporations and file annual reports. When you fail to file for 2 consecutive years, the corporation is automatically dissolved. You've been operating an illegal organization for over 2 decades. This is ridiculous, Margaret said. We have authority under the covenants. They're recorded with the county. Covenants require an enforcement mechanism. Without a legally existing HOA, there's no mechanism to enforce them. You're essentially a social club that's been illegally collecting money and threatening residents. If this is true, we can just refile and continue, Susan said. You could, but that would require following proper procedures, holding legitimate elections, creating bylaws, and most importantly, it wouldn't retroactively legitimize anything you've done for the past 22 years. Every fine assessed during that time is legally void. The other residents were murmuring now. One man stood up. I paid a $1,500 fine last year for building a shed without approval. Are you saying I can get that back? Potentially, yes. If the HOA had no legal authority to fine you, that's money taken under false pretenses. Margaret stood up, her chair scraping loudly. This meeting is over. Everyone out now. You can't just end a meeting because you don't like what's being discussed, I said. That's another violation of basic parliamentary procedure. I said OUT. Margaret's voice echoed in the small room. She was shaking with rage. Gerald and Susan looked at each other uncertainly. The residents began filing out, several stopping to ask me questions about their own fines and violations. I handed out my phone number and suggested they consult with a real estate attorney. When I got home, I found my mailbox had been destroyed. It lay in pieces on the snow-covered ground, clearly struck with something heavy. I took photos, filed a police report online, and added it to my growing documentation of harassment. The next day, I received a cease and desist letter from an attorney representing the HOA. It demanded I stop spreading false information about the HOA's legal status, threatening me with a defamation lawsuit if I continued. The letter was laughably bad, full of legal jargon that didn't actually apply to the situation. I called the attorney whose name was on the letterhead. A receptionist answered, and I asked to speak with John Matthews about the Meadowbrook Hills HOA matter. "I'm sorry, Mr. Matthews is no longer with the firm," she said. "This letter is dated yesterday. Mr. Matthews retired 3 years ago. May I direct you to another attorney?" "No thanks." I hung up. Margaret had used old letterhead, probably found it on the internet, and forged a lawyer's letter. That was a serious crime. I contacted the Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission to report the fake legal letter, then called the Rockford Police Department non-emergency line to file a report about it. A detective named Rodriguez took my information and said he'd look into it. The harassment continued. Someone egged my house. My trash cans disappeared, and I found them 3 blocks away in a retention pond. A pile of dog waste appeared on my front step. I installed security cameras, which immediately paid off when I caught Margaret herself walking up to my door at 2 a.m. with a can of spray paint. The camera footage was clear. Margaret Caldwell, HOA president, attempting to vandalize my property. I called Detective Rodriguez, who came by the next morning to review the footage. "That's definitely her," he said, watching the video. "You want to press charges?" "Absolutely." "I'll head over there now and have a conversation with Miss Caldwell. We've actually been getting several calls about HOA-related harassment in this neighborhood over the past few months. This might be part of a larger pattern." 2 hours later, Detective Rodriguez called me back. "Miss Caldwell has been arrested for attempted vandalism and criminal trespassing." During our conversation with her, she became extremely agitated and made threats against several residents, including you. "We're also investigating the forged legal letter, which is a Class 4 felony in Illinois." "What happens now?" "She'll be arraigned tomorrow. Given the circumstances, she'll probably be released on bond, but there will be a restraining order prohibiting contact with you. I'd recommend keeping your security cameras running and documenting any further harassment." That evening, I got calls from 4 different neighbors, all asking what was happening. Word spread fast in a small subdivision. By the next day, the whole neighborhood knew Margaret Caldwell had been arrested for harassing me. The fallout was swift. Susan and Gerald held an emergency meeting and announced they were dissolving the board until the HOA's legal status could be sorted out. They suspended all fines and enforcement actions pending a legal review. Several residents started asking for refunds of dues and fines paid over the years. Margaret made bail and immediately violated the restraining order by leaving a handwritten note on my door threatening to destroy me. I called the police. She was arrested again, and this time the judge revoked her bail. She would remain in jail until her hearing. With Margaret out of the picture, the neighborhood felt different. People actually waved when I drove by. A few neighbors stopped by to apologize for not speaking up sooner about the harassment. Old Mrs. Henderson brought me cookies and thanked me for standing up to the HOA. I learned that Margaret had been targeting people for years, using the HOA as her personal fiefdom. She'd driven out several families with constant violations and harassment. She'd manipulated board elections to keep herself in power. She'd even embezzled nearly $20,000 from HOA dues that were supposed to go toward neighborhood maintenance. The embezzlement discovery came when an attorney hired by several residents reviewed the HOA's financial records. Margaret had been writing checks to herself for administrative expenses and consulting fees that were never approved by the board or the membership. That added several more felony charges to her growing legal problems. Her court date came in late March. The snow had melted, revealing brown grass and the debris of winter. I attended the hearing, along with about 20 other residents she'd harassed over the years. The prosecutor laid out a damning case: vandalism, trespassing, harassment, forgery, embezzlement, and a pattern of abuse that stretched back years. Margaret's attorney tried to argue that she was simply a dedicated volunteer who'd made some mistakes in judgment. The judge wasn't buying it. Between the video evidence, the financial records, and testimony from multiple victims, Margaret Caldwell was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 3 years in prison, with credit for time served, plus 5 years probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution to all the residents she'd illegally fined and from whom she'd embezzled. The civil cases followed. I sued for harassment, vandalism, and emotional distress, winning a judgment of $15,000. Other residents filed similar suits. Margaret ended up losing her house to pay the judgments and restitution. With Margaret gone, the neighborhood came together to figure out what to do about the HOA. We held a properly noticed meeting where everyone could vote. The overwhelming consensus was to dissolve it completely. The covenants would remain on file with the county, but they would only be enforceable through individual civil action, meaning someone would have to sue you in court to enforce them. No more violation notices, no more fines, no more harassing phone calls. We did form a voluntary neighborhood association to handle common area maintenance, but it was exactly that, voluntary. No mandatory dues, no enforcement power, just neighbors helping neighbors. The difference was night and day. My snow removal business continued to thrive. I ended up buying that second truck and hiring 2 part-time employees for the next winter season. Several former Meadowbrook Hills residents who'd been driven out by Margaret actually moved back once word spread about the changes. The neighborhood became a genuinely pleasant place to live. David became a good friend. We'd have beers in the summer, watching our kids play in his backyard pool he'd installed without needing HOA approval. Mrs. Henderson became like an adopted grandmother, always ready with cookies and stories about old Rockford. The Patels hosted a neighborhood block party where everyone brought food, and we celebrated the end of the HOA tyranny. I even started dating someone I met through the whole mess. Sarah was an attorney who'd represented several residents in their cases against Margaret. She'd been impressed by my documentation and research, and we'd hit it off over coffee while discussing legal strategies. By summer, we were officially a couple, and by Christmas, I was thinking about proposing. The house I'd bought as a fresh start after my divorce had turned into an actual home. The neighborhood that had seemed like a nightmare at first became a community I was proud to be part of. All because I'd refused to back down to a bully with a title and a stack of meaningless violation notices. I learned some important lessons through the whole experience. First, always research an HOA before buying in one. Check if it's actually a legal entity, review its financial records, talk to current residents about their experiences. Second, document everything. My photos, videos, and detailed notes were crucial in both the criminal and civil cases. Third, know your rights. HOAs have limited powers, and they have to follow the law like everyone else. Most importantly, I learned that standing up to bullies works. Margaret Caldwell had terrorized the neighborhood for years because everyone was afraid to fight back. The moment someone finally said no and meant it, her whole house of cards collapsed. She'd built her power on fear and intimidation, and it couldn't withstand someone who actually challenged her authority. The winter after Margaret's conviction was the busiest I'd ever had. Word of mouth from satisfied customers brought me more business than I could handle. I ended up hiring 4 employees and buying a 3rd truck. We cleared snow from over 100 properties that season, and I made more money than I ever had working for someone else. But the best part wasn't the money. It was driving through my neighborhood on snowy mornings, seeing families outside building snowmen, kids sledding down hills, neighbors helping each other clear sidewalks. No violation notices, no harassment, no fear, just people living their lives in peace. Susan, the former board member, apologized to me personally one spring afternoon. She stopped by with homemade bread and tears in her eyes. I should have stood up to her years ago. I knew what she was doing was wrong, but I was afraid she'd come after me next. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all that." I accepted her apology. Holding grudges wouldn't change the past, and Susan had been a victim too in her way. She'd been manipulated and intimidated just like everyone else. The real villain was Margaret, and she was paying for her crimes. Gerald, the other board member, left the neighborhood entirely. He'd been more involved in Margaret's schemes than initially known, helping her falsify records and intimidate residents. While he wasn't charged criminally, the civil liability was enough to bankrupt him. Last I heard, he'd moved to Indiana and was working at a hardware store. Sometimes the consequences of going along with wrongdoing are nearly as severe as being the instigator. The city of Rockford ended up investigating HOAs across the area after the Meadowbrook Hills case made news. They found that nearly 30% of local HOAs had similar problems: dissolved corporations still operating, embezzlement, harassment, illegal fines. The city created new oversight procedures and a complaint hotline for residents dealing with HOA abuse. I was interviewed by the local paper, the Rockford Register-Star, about the whole situation. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica, wrote a detailed piece about HOA overreach and the importance of resident rights. The story went viral, getting picked up by news outlets across the state and even some national coverage. For a few weeks, I was the face of HOA resistance, which was surreal and a little uncomfortable, but the attention had a positive side. Residents across Illinois and surrounding states reached out to me for advice on dealing with their own HOA problems. I couldn't provide legal counsel, but I could share my experience and encourage people to document everything and know their rights. I helped connect people with attorneys, showed them how to research their HOA's corporate status, and offered moral support to those going through similar harassment. One case particularly stood out. A disabled veteran in Aurora, Illinois, was being fined for having a handicap parking sign in his driveway without HOA approval. Despite providing medical documentation of his disability, the HOA refused to back down and was threatening legal action. I connected him with Sarah, who took his case pro bono. Within 2 months, the HOA not only dropped the fines but paid damages for disability discrimination. The HOA president in that case also ended up facing charges. It seemed like Margaret Caldwell wasn't an isolated case. Power-hungry people were attracted to HOA boards because they offered authority with minimal oversight. The combination of petty power and lack of accountability created perfect conditions for abuse. But people were starting to fight back, and that made me hopeful for the future. My business expanded beyond snow removal. In summer, I offered lawn care and landscaping services. The same work ethic and customer service that made my snow removal business successful translated to warm weather work. By my second summer in the house, I had a full-time year-round business with 6 employees and more work than we could handle. Sarah and I got married in September of that year. A small ceremony in Mrs. Henderson's backyard with the whole neighborhood invited. It felt right to celebrate there, surrounded by the community that had formed from the ashes of the HOA nightmare. Mrs. Henderson cried through the whole ceremony, and her husband's vintage Cadillac served as our getaway car. We bought a bigger house on the edge of the neighborhood, still within Meadowbrook Hills but with enough space for the family we were planning. No HOA meant we could do what we wanted with the property. Sarah wanted a garden. I wanted a bigger garage for my equipment. We could do both without asking anyone's permission. 3 years after the initial confrontation over Margaret demanding I clear her driveway, I was sitting on my back deck on a beautiful summer evening. Sarah was inside making dinner. My trucks were parked in the oversized garage I'd built. The business was thriving. The neighborhood was peaceful. Life was good. I thought about that February morning when Margaret had blocked my driveway, demanding I clear hers first. How angry I'd been at the entitlement, the assumption that she deserved special treatment just because she had a title. How that single confrontation had spiraled into months of harassment, legal battles, and ultimately, justice. If I could go back and change anything, I wouldn't. Every challenge had taught me something. Every conflict had made me stronger. Every small victory had built toward the larger triumph. Margaret Caldwell had tried to make my life miserable, and instead, she'd inadvertently made it better by forcing me to stand up for myself and my rights. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I opened it to find a young couple, probably in their late 20s, holding a printout of a house listing. "Hi, we're thinking about making an offer on the house 3 doors down. We heard you had some HOA issues a few years back. Is that all resolved?" I smiled. "Come on in. Let me tell you a story about why this is the best neighborhood in Rockford to live in. But first, I should mention, there is no HOA anymore, and that's exactly why it's so great." They stayed for an hour, asking questions, hearing about the history, learning about the neighborhood. By the time they left, they were excited about making an offer. 2 weeks later, they closed on the house and became our newest neighbors, a young family with a newborn and dreams of building a life in a place without HOA tyranny. Word continued to spread. Meadowbrook Hills became known as the neighborhood that had stood up to its HOA and won. Property values actually increased after the HOA was dissolved, contrary to the fear-mongering that claimed HOAs were necessary to maintain values. Turned out people were willing to pay a premium to live somewhere they could actually control their own property. Margaret served 18 months of her 3-year sentence before being released on parole. One of the conditions was that she couldn't live within 5 miles of Meadowbrook Hills or contact any of her former victims. She moved to a small apartment on the south side of Rockford and got a job as a cashier at a grocery store. A mutual acquaintance told me she'd been humbled by the experience, though I honestly didn't care. She was out of my life, and that was all that mattered. The fake legal letter she'd created ended up being a bigger deal than the other charges in some ways. The Illinois Bar Association used her case as an example in ethics training, showing how forgery and impersonating an attorney could lead to serious consequences. The actual attorney whose name she'd forged, John Matthews, came out of retirement briefly to testify at her trial. He'd been appalled that his name was used in such a way. "My employees became like family. 2 of them, brothers named Jake and Marcus, had been working odd jobs before I hired them. They'd proven to be reliable, hardworking, and great with customers. I promoted them to crew leaders and gave them profit-sharing bonuses. When they asked about eventually buying into the business, I didn't dismiss it. We started talking about a path to partnership, something that would benefit everyone. The business grew beyond Rockford. We started getting calls from Loves Park, Mashesney Park, even as far as Belvedere and Oregon. We couldn't handle all the requests, so I started training competitors. That might sound counterintuitive, but I figured a rising tide lifts all boats. If there were more professional, reliable snow removal services in the area, it would elevate the whole industry. Plus, the goodwill generated referrals from customers outside our service area who appreciated that I connected them with trustworthy providers. Sarah's law practice also grew. She became known as the go-to attorney for HOA disputes, and her practice expanded to include real estate law, contract disputes, and small business law. We often joked that Margaret Caldwell had inadvertently launched both of our successful careers. If she just left me alone, I'd probably still be a small operation with one truck, and Sarah would still be a general practice attorney taking whatever cases came her way. 5 years after the confrontation, the Rockford Register-Star did a follow-up piece. Jessica, the same reporter who'd covered the original story, came back to see how things had developed. She interviewed me, Sarah, several neighbors, and even drove out to the prison to interview Margaret, though Margaret refused to talk. The article painted a picture of how one person's refusal to accept bullying had transformed an entire neighborhood. It talked about the voluntary neighborhood association we'd formed, how property values had increased, how community engagement had skyrocketed. It mentioned the ripple effects, the other HOAs that had reformed or dissolved after seeing what happened in Meadowbrook Hills. At the end of the article, Jessica asked me what advice I'd give to others dealing with HOA issues. I thought about it carefully before responding. Document everything. Know your rights. Don't be afraid to push back when something is wrong. Most bullies, whether they're individuals or organizations, rely on people being too tired, too scared, or too broke to fight back. The moment you actually stand up to them, they often collapse. And remember, an HOA is supposed to serve the community, not rule it. The moment it becomes about power instead of service, it's lost its way. The article ended with a photo of our neighborhood block party. 60-plus residents gathered in the park, no violation notices in sight, just people enjoying their community. It was the perfect encapsulation of what we'd built from the ashes of Margaret's tyranny. My relationship with my neighbors deepened over the years. David and I started a tradition of summer barbecues, rotating between houses, everyone bringing dishes. Mrs. Henderson taught my mom's old recipes to Sarah, passing on traditions. The Patels introduced us to Diwali celebrations. The Ramirez family taught half the neighborhood to make authentic tamales. Without the HOA's restrictive rules, people felt free to express themselves. One couple painted their house a cheerful yellow. Another put in a fountain. Someone built an amazing treehouse for their kids. The neighborhood developed character and charm that sterile HOA rules would have prevented. And you know what? Property values kept rising because people wanted to live somewhere with personality and freedom. I often wondered what the neighborhood would have been like if I'd just backed down that first morning. If I'd cleared Margaret's driveway first, paid her extortion fee disguised as professional courtesy, accepted the bogus violations without question. The easy path would have been to submit, to just go along with her demands. But that would have meant living in fear, watching my back, accepting injustice. It would have meant Margaret continued terrorizing the neighborhood unchecked. It would have meant other residents suffered without hope of relief. Taking the hard path, standing up for what was right, had required courage and cost me time, money, and stress. but it was worth it 1,000 times over. Sarah and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Riley, in the spring of year 6. Bringing her home to Meadowbrook Hills felt significant. She would grow up in a neighborhood where people looked out for each other, where petty rules didn't govern daily life, where community meant something real. No HOA would tell us what color curtains we could have in her nursery or fine us for having her swing set in the backyard. Mrs. Henderson held Riley for the first time with tears streaming down her face. "This neighborhood is alive again," she said. "For so many years it was like living in a pretty prison. Now it's a real home." That summed it up better than anything I could have said. We'd transformed a pretty prison into a real home, and all it took was one person saying no to a bully with a clipboard. The snow removal business continued each winter, and each time the first major snowfall arrived, I thought about that February morning when this all started. I'd head out at 4 a.m., coffee in hand, ready to take care of my paying customers. And if I drove past what used to be Margaret Caldwell's house, now owned by a lovely retired couple who'd never once demanded free service or special treatment, I'd smile at how far we'd all come. Life has a funny way of working out. What started as a nightmare, a violation notice in my mailbox and a demanding HOA president blocking my driveway, turned into the best thing that could have happened. It pushed me to stand up for myself, to build a real business, to find love, to create a genuine community. Margaret Caldwell thought she could bully me into submission. Instead, she inadvertently gave me the push I needed to build the life I'd always wanted. And that, more than any legal victory or financial success, was the real triumph. I turned her attempt to make me miserable into fuel for creating something better. I transformed her negativity into positive change for an entire neighborhood. I'd proven that standing up to bullies, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, even when the easy path beckons, is always worth it. The sun was setting on another beautiful summer evening in Meadowbrook Hills. The sound of children playing echoed through the neighborhood. Someone was grilling, the smell of burgers wafting on the breeze. A neighbor waved from across the street. Sarah called from inside that dinner was ready. I took one last look at the neighborhood I'd fought for, the community we'd built, the home we'd created. No violation notices, no HOA tyranny, no Margaret Caldwell demanding special treatment. Just neighbors living their lives in peace and freedom. It was exactly as it should be, and I wouldn't change a single thing about how we got here.